June 2, 1991, Chicago, Illinois. Chicago Stadium, 1800 West Madison Street. The opening tip for Game 1 of the 1991 NBA Finals is scheduled for 5:30 in the afternoon, a Sunday evening slot chosen by NBC for maximum national viewership. By 4 o'clock, the streets around the stadium are already impassable. The West Side neighborhood that surrounds Chicago Stadium has seen every kind of crowd in the building's 62-year history, fights and concerts and political rallies and playoff games that echoed across the city. But this one carries a weight that none of the others quite reached. This is the finals. This is the moment that 7 years of Michael Jordan had been pointing toward. 7 years of individual brilliance and first-round exits and conference finals losses, and 3 consecutive playoff defeats at the hands of Detroit's bad boys. 7 years of a city being told that the player they had was something extraordinary, while the team around him hadn't yet become what extraordinary players require. Chicago had waited. Tonight, the waiting was supposed to end. Chicago Stadium held 18,676 people when filled to capacity, and on the night of June 2, 1991, all 18,676 of those seats were occupied, plus standing room, plus the technical areas that people found ways into despite having no legitimate claim to them. The building was an acoustic phenomenon even without that many bodies in it. The concrete and steel amplified crowd noise in a way that made the decibel level inside more comparable to a jet engine than a sporting venue. Opposing players described playing there as a physical experience rather than an auditory one, sound you felt in your chest before your ears processed it. The parquet floor, laid out in the center of all that noise, was the stage that Jordan had been building toward since he put on number 23 for the first time in the fall of 1984. But the Los Angeles Lakers had been here before. They had been to the finals 12 times in the previous 2 decades, winning 8 of them. Earvin Magic Johnson had played in 9 finals in 12 professional seasons. He had 5 championship rings. He had 3 Most Valuable Player awards. He had 3 Finals MVP awards. He had led the league in assists 4 times in his career, and in the spring of 1991, he had done something that no point guard in the history of the game had ever done, which was surpass Oscar Robertson as the all-time career assist leader. On April 15th, just 7 weeks before Game 1, in a 112-106 win over the Dallas Mavericks at the Forum in Inglewood, Johnson had lobbed a pass to Terry Teagle for a 15-foot turnaround jumper with 5:44 left in the second quarter. And that pass, assist number 9,888, had broken the record that Robertson had held since 1974. The game had been stopped for 15 minutes while Johnson received a standing ovation from 17,505 people. Oscar Robertson himself had sent a telegram. Magic Johnson had stood at half court and received the tribute of an entire building in a way that only legends receive tributes. Not with surprise, but with the composed acknowledgement of a man who had always known this was coming. That was the man coming to Chicago Stadium on June 2nd. Not a player at the end of his career coasting on reputation, but Earvin Johnson, 31 years old, still averaging 19.4 points, 12.5 assists, and 7 rebounds per game in the regular season that had just concluded. Still the most complete point guard the sport had ever produced by any serious measure. Still capable of things on a basketball floor that no other 6'9" man had been able to do before him, or had done since. He had grown stronger and more powerful over the years. The Showtime Lakers of the early 80s had been built on speed and transition, but the team that arrived in Chicago in 1991 was playing more half-court basketball, more post-up basketball, and Johnson had adapted to it as he adapted to everything, seamlessly, completely, without any apparent loss of function. He had simply grown into a different player who could do all the same things and more. The hype around the 1991 finals had been constructed on the premise of a matchup between 2 men, Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan. The NBA understood that this series was being watched as a coronation of sorts, a handoff of the league's symbolic leadership from the player who had defined the 1980s to the player who had won 5 consecutive scoring titles. NBC had built its promotional campaign around the rivalry. Every preview, every analysis, every conversation in every barbershop and sports bar in America that June had come back to the same question, which was whether Jordan could finally do what everyone said he couldn't do, which was win. Magic Johnson read the previews and felt something he hadn't felt about an opponent in several years, which was genuine interest. He had watched Jordan the way everyone had watched Jordan, with the particular appreciation of a great player watching another great player at work, with the understanding of someone who knew what it cost to do what Jordan was doing and could therefore measure the cost accurately. He had seen the scoring titles and the Defensive Player of the Year award and the dunks and the commercials and the way the league's cultural gravity had begun shifting toward Chicago and away from Los Angeles over the previous 3 seasons. He had processed all of it, and he had believed, with the confidence of a man who had won 5 championships and had never lost a final series, that he and his Lakers had something that Jordan and his Bulls had not yet earned. They had the experience of having been here before. They had the knowledge of what it felt like when the lights were brightest and the stakes were highest, and your body needed to do the thing it had been trained to do in front of the largest possible audience. Jordan, for all his gifts, for all his scoring titles, for all the individual brilliance that had redefined what one player could do on a basketball floor, had never been here. He had not yet learned what the finals required, because the finals was the only classroom in which that particular lesson was available. The Celtics coach, Red Auerbach, had said something about Jordan years earlier that Johnson had noted and filed away. Auerbach had been asked whether Jordan's individual gifts could win a championship on their own, and the old coach had answered with the bluntness of a man who had seen 9 champions he'd built and understood precisely what a champion required. A great player scores points, Auerbach had said. A great player who wins championships makes everyone else better. Johnson had built his entire career on the second principle. His assist records were not just statistical achievements. They were the accumulated evidence of 11 seasons spent making teammates better than they could make themselves, of seeing the floor as a map of possibilities rather than a personal scoring opportunity, of trusting that the sum of the collective was always greater than the contribution of any individual. That was what he believed. That was what the 5 rings had confirmed. He warmed up at Chicago Stadium and studied the noise. Johnson had played in enough hostile buildings that hostile crowds had become simply another element of the environment he managed, no more disruptive than weather. He watched Jordan warm up across the floor with the eyes of a competitor who had spent 11 seasons learning what a player's warm-up routine could reveal about his mental state and intentions. Jordan in warm-ups was a controlled exercise in routine, each drill the same as the last time and the time before. Nothing wasted, nothing demonstrative. Just a man preparing his instrument with the methodical attention of a craftsman who understood that preparation was not separate from performance, but was the first part of it. Jordan knew he was being watched. He always knew. The awareness of being observed had been part of his operating environment since college, since the national championship game against Georgetown in 1982, when he made the shot that made him nationally famous, a career conducted under the particular pressure of enormous public expectation that Jordan had not merely survived, but had metabolized into fuel. He knew Magic Johnson was watching him across the floor of Chicago Stadium, and he did not adjust what he was doing by a single degree. He finished his layup line and his shooting drill and his stretching in exactly the sequence he always finished them. And when he was done, he went to the bench and sat with the stillness of a man whose interior was operating at a frequency the outside world couldn't access. Phil Jackson, in his second season as the Bulls head coach, had designed the triangle offense specifically to address the critique that had followed Jordan from the moment he arrived in the league, which was that a team built around one scorer could not win a championship because championships required everyone. Jackson had watched the Jazz and the Lakers and the Celtics build their dynasties around systems that distributed the ball intelligently and created advantages through movement and spacing rather than individual brilliance. And he had built the triangle as his answer to the question of how you integrate a player of Jordan's individual capacity into a system that could beat those teams in the playoffs. The result, over 2 full seasons, had been a Bulls team that lost only twice in the first 3 rounds of the 1991 playoffs, sweeping the Knicks, eliminating the 76ers in 5, and sweeping the Pistons, the team that had beaten them 3 consecutive times in 4 games. The Pistons had walked off the court with 8 seconds left in their series-ending loss rather than stay to shake hands, which was its own kind of tribute to what Jordan and his team had become. The opening tip of Game 1 went to the Bulls, and Jordan scored 15 points in the first quarter alone. He also had 3 rebounds and 5 assists in those 12 minutes, operating in the triangle with a total engagement that surprised observers who had expected him to attack. He was not attacking, he was operating. There is a difference that basketball experts can see clearly and that casual observers sometimes miss. A player attacking is trying to score against a defense. A player operating is trying to find what the defense will give, exploiting the available space rather than forcing entry through the unavailable one, treating the defense as a conversation rather than an obstacle. Jordan in the first quarter of Game 1 was having a conversation with the Lakers defense, and the conversation was going well. Magic Johnson watched the first quarter from the floor, not the bench, and what he saw made him adjust his assessment of the situation. Jordan was not behaving like a player in his first finals appearance. He was behaving like a player who had been here before, and Johnson understood with the clarity of a competitor who had made this observation about other players in other series that the absence of first finals nerves was either a sign of genuine readiness or a sign that the nerves had been converted into something else, something that expressed itself as action rather than as anxiety. Either interpretation was concerning for the Lakers. Johnson found his own rhythm in that first game, and it was, by any external measure, a remarkable performance. He finished with 19 points, 10 rebounds, and 11 assists, his 29th career playoff triple-double, achieved in the highest stakes game of the year. He backed Jordan down repeatedly in the post, exploiting the 6-inch height difference and the weight advantage, converting at an efficiency that confirmed everything the scouts had said about his post-up game in 1991, being different from his post-up game in earlier years, more deliberate and more technically precise. He hit back-to-back three-pointers in the third quarter to give the Lakers their largest lead of the game, and he ran the Lakers' offense with the intelligence of a conductor who understood every instrument and could hear when any one of them was even slightly out of tune. The Bulls won Games 1 by 2 points, 93-91, in a finish that required Sam Perkins to hit a three-pointer with 14 seconds left, and Byron Scott to make one of 2 free throws in the final moments. Jordan shot well, but his 17-foot jumper in the closing seconds rattled out. The Lakers left Chicago Stadium having won a game in which Magic Johnson posted a triple-double in the NBA Finals, and Michael Jordan had played well enough to win most games in most circumstances. And they boarded their plane for the flight back to Los Angeles, feeling what a team feels when it has stolen home court advantage from a team that was favored in the series. They felt what Magic Johnson had described before the series as the advantage of experience, of having been in these moments before, of knowing that the finals was not simply a more important playoff series, but a different kind of pressure that produced different responses from players who hadn't yet calibrated themselves to it. It was a Thursday afternoon, June 5th, 1991, 3 days later, that the series moved to what it had always been moving toward, which was the question of who these two men actually were when the moment was the biggest available moment. Game 2. Chicago Stadium again. The building was if anything louder than it had been on Sunday. 18,676 people who had been processing the Game 1 loss for 72 hours and who were now present with the energy of a crowd that understands a series can be defined in the next 48 minutes. Jordan picked up 2 fouls in the first quarter, guarding Magic Johnson. The first came early, a reach on a Johnson drive that the referee called cleanly. The second came 3 possessions later, a body foul in the post as Johnson backed him down again, and Phil Jackson pulled Jordan to the bench with 6 minutes left in the first quarter. 2 fouls, no further capacity to guard Johnson without the risk of fouling out before halftime. The crowd noise shifted frequency slightly, not quieter but different, the sound of a crowd recalibrating in real time. Jackson made the decision that would define the series, which was to put Scottie Pippen on Magic Johnson and move Jordan to guard Vlade Divac, the Lakers center. It was a decision made from necessity, not strategy, which is the most honest description of most of the great tactical decisions in basketball history. Magic Johnson noticed the switch immediately. Pippen was 6'7" and could guard Johnson at the point while also protecting the paint when help was needed, and his length created passing angles that Johnson could not open as easily as he could against Jordan. But Johnson had been here before, had seen every defensive adjustment a team could construct against him, and he trusted his ability to find solutions within the Showtime architecture that Pat Riley had built and that Mike Dunleavy had adapted. He worked the first half with the ball in his hands and managed it. The Lakers trailed by 5 at halftime, 58-53, with Horace Grant having provided 14 points off the Bulls bench as the beneficiary of Jordan's unselfish play in the first half. Jordan had scored only 2 points in the first 20 minutes, a deliberate investment in establishing Grant and Bill Cartwright and John Paxson in the flow of the offense, making them feel the ball, building the collective rhythm that Jackson's triangle was designed to produce. Magic Johnson understood this. He understood it as a competitor and as a basketball intellect, and as a man who had spent 11 seasons doing exactly this thing, subordinating his individual scoring to the requirements of the team, making everyone else feel important and capable and trusted. He had watched Jordan do this in the first half and felt something complicated. Not admiration exactly, but the specific recognition of a player seeing a quality in an opponent that he had thought was his exclusive territory. Jordan, in the first half of Game 2, had been Magic Johnson. He had moved without the ball, found teammates, distributed the rock with the generosity of a man who understood that the most important assist was not the one that ended in a basket, but the one that made a teammate feel like they mattered in a game of this size. The third quarter belonged to Jordan. He returned to the floor in the third quarter, foul trouble resolved for the moment. Pippen doing the work on Magic that freed Jordan to operate offensively, and he began making shots, not forcing shots, making shots that the defense was offering, pull-up jumpers in the mid-range, drives when the lane opened, free throws when contact was drawn. He hit his next 13 shots in a sequence so clean and so relentless that the building's volume climbed past the threshold, where individual sounds became indistinguishable from each other and merged into a continuous physical presence. 13 consecutive field goals. The Bulls expanded their halftime lead to 26 points in the second half. Magic Johnson, who had controlled Game 1 with the assurance of a man who owned the currency the game was transacted in, found himself watching the third quarter unfold with a feeling he could not immediately categorize. The Bulls were making everything. Not Jordan alone, but all of them. Grant and Cartwright and Paxson and Pippen, the whole system operating at the temperature. Jordan's presence raised it too. The triangle finding its expression in 17 of 20 field goals made over an extended stretch that turned a competitive game into something approaching a statement. Johnson called for the ball when he could, and worked in the post and found teammates and ran the offense the way he had run it for 11 seasons, and none of it was producing the results he was used to, because the Bulls' defensive rotations were so thoroughly prepared that every available angle had been closed before he reached it. The fourth quarter. The game was decided, but the moment was not yet complete. Jordan returned from a brief rest with the Bulls holding a lead large enough that the outcome was no longer in serious question, and Cliff Levingston had the ball on the right wing. By instinct or by design, he passed it to Jordan, who caught it standing near the top of the key, 6 feet from the basket, the game's most recognizable player with the ball in his hands in the finals for the first time. Jordan drove left toward the baseline, his first step long and low the way his first steps always were, creating separation from his defender with the acceleration that scouts had been describing as physically improbable since his college years, an acceleration that seemed to begin from a stillness and reach full speed in a single footfall. He went up with the ball in his right hand, elevating toward the backboard, the body rising with the fluidity that makes Jordan's movement at full speed look slower than everyone else's because it lacks the mechanical effort visible in less gifted athletes. AC Green moved into the lane from the baseline. Sam Perkins took a half step in his direction. The geometry of the play had arranged itself so that the right-hand finish Jordan had committed to was no longer available, not without contact, not without a charging call or a block or a disrupted shot that would miss the way forced shots miss. What happened next happened in the air, which is a place where Jordan had always operated by different rules than everyone else. The ball moved from his right hand to his left. Not a transfer, not a deliberate repositioning, but a motion fluid enough that the ball seemed briefly to belong to neither hand, to exist in the space between them like something suspended, before it arrived in the left hand and the left wrist, applied the specific amount of spin required to bank a layup off the backboard at that angle, and that distance, the ball climbing in an arc that looked impossible until it looked inevitable. Finding the glass and falling through the net, while Jordan's body was still descending, and his tongue was still out, and AC Green was still moving, and Sam Perkins was still deciding, and the crowd was already past the point where crowd noise is describable. Marv Albert's voice came through the NBC broadcast on a frequency that people watching across the country heard simultaneously, the inflection climbing through its syllables like the ball had climbed through the air. "Oh, a spectacular move by Michael Jordan." The building did not react the way buildings usually react to significant plays, which is with noise and then subsidence. Chicago Stadium reacted as if the atmosphere itself had been restructured, as if the atoms in the building had been rearranged into a new configuration that would not permit silence. The sound continued and amplified, and the camera found Magic Johnson standing near half court, and what was on his face was not what faces look like when the opposing team makes a good play. It was something more internal than that. More structural, the expression of a man whose understanding of what he had just watched was arriving in waves rather than all at once, the first wave carrying the information of the play itself, and the subsequent waves carrying the implications. Johnson described it afterward the way people describe experiences that require new vocabulary to convey. When he came down the lane, he just went one way, put it in one hand, floated about 5 more yards and said, "Well, I don't know," Johnson said, and then he went off the glass. Johnson had been describing basketball plays for 11 professional seasons to journalists and coaches and teammates, and the grammar of his descriptions had always been precise. The language of a man who thought about basketball in structural terms, who could identify the principle underneath the play rather than just the play itself. The grammar of this description was different. The ellipsis in the middle of it, the "well, I don't know," was the place where Magic Johnson's vocabulary ran out, where the play exceeded the available framework, and what filled that space was something closer to wonder than to competitive analysis. The Bulls won Game 2 107-86. Jordan finished with 33 points, 13 assists, and 7 rebounds, shooting 15 for 18 from the field. He had played both halves of the game at the same time, the first half as the distributor who made his teammates better, the second half as the scorer who made the lead insurmountable, and he had moved between those two modes without a visible seam, without a moment in which the game appeared to be requiring him to choose between them. Magic Johnson finished with 14 points and 10 assists. The numbers were not embarrassing, but they represented a game in which he had been present without being decisive, which was a category Magic Johnson had not occupied in important playoff games before. After the game, Johnson was asked about Jordan, and specifically about the move in the fourth quarter, and he answered with the candor of a competitor who was not yet finished with the series, but who understood that something had been revealed that evening that required honest accounting. "When you play someone that many times during the regular season," Johnson said, paraphrasing something he would say in different ways for years afterward, "you think you know what they can do, and then they show you something they haven't shown you before, and you realize the ceiling was higher than you thought." He paused. Much higher. The Bulls won games 3, 4, and 5, taking the championship 4 games to 1. Jordan averaging 31.2 points, 11.4 assists, and 6.6 rebounds for the series, shooting 56% from the field, winning the Finals MVP award in a performance that was so complete in both its individual and collective dimensions that it retired the debate about whether he could do what it took to win, which was the only debate that had mattered since he arrived. The Bulls' defense held the Lakers to a record-low 458 points for a 5-game finals, which was the number that described what the Bulls were collectively, a team whose defense was built from Jordan's competitive ferocity and Pippen's length and Jackson's system, and the accumulated result of 7 years of organizational patience. Magic Johnson, in Game 5, the final game of his career, posted 20 points, 11 rebounds, and 20 assists, leading a team that had lost James Worthy and Byron Scott to injuries, and was facing a Bulls team that had become, in the course of those 5 games, definitively and permanently the dominant force in the sport. He played that game with everything he had, because that was what Magic Johnson always did. He got his numbers because Magic Johnson always got his numbers. The Lakers still lost by 11. On November 7, 1991, 5 months after the final buzzer of that series, Magic Johnson stood before cameras at the Great Western Forum in Inglewood and announced that he had tested positive for the HIV virus and was immediately retiring from professional basketball. The world received the news with the shock that comes when someone who has seemed to exist outside the ordinary operating conditions of human vulnerability is revealed to be subject to them after all. Johnson stood in the light and delivered the announcement with the same composed authority he had brought to every other moment of his public life. And the composure was not absence of feeling, but the presence of a very specific kind of courage. The courage to perform grace under circumstances that didn't require it and would have excused its absence. In the years that followed, when people asked Johnson about the 1991 finals, he did not describe it primarily as a loss. He described it as the moment when he understood what Michael Jordan was actually becoming, as opposed to what everyone had been saying he was becoming. "There is a version of Jordan in people's minds," Johnson would say. "The scorer, the dunker, the commercials, the shoes. And then there is what I saw that series, which was someone who had figured out how to be a complete basketball player, how to make everyone around him better, how to win the right way, and who could also do that move in the fourth quarter when it mattered. Those two things together are what championships look like. He had learned it. He went and got it." Johnson would pause when he reached this part of the story, the same pause he had displayed in the post-game press conference in 1991, the pause of a man taking an honest accounting. "I spent 11 years believing that basketball intelligence was the highest form of the game," Johnson would say. "He showed me it wasn't the ceiling. He showed me it was the floor, and he was building above it." Jordan, for his part, kept the championship trophy for one night before beginning preparation for the next season. the next challenge, the next thing that needed winning. He had cried when the final buzzer sounded, openly and without apparent embarrassment, the tears of a man who had wanted something for 7 years and had finally obtained it and was feeling the full weight of the weight all at once. He held the trophy and cried and said he had never been this emotional publicly, which was the truest thing he had said in public in years, the first crack in the controlled exterior that had been his defense against a world that had wanted to define him before he had finished becoming himself. He dried his eyes. He started thinking about next year. The trophy gets heavy if you carry it too long. The only way to keep winning is to put it down and start over, and the only players who can start over after achieving what Jordan had just achieved are the ones for whom the achievement was never the destination. It was always only the evidence, the record that confirmed what the fire inside them already knew, and fire does not extinguish when it finds what it has been burning toward. It finds more to burn, because fire, once established, does not ask permission to continue. It simply continues, and the only question available to the people in its path is whether they will be fuel or whether they will find a way to step aside.